From being born into a family in extreme poverty to becoming one of the leading figures of the Soviet Union, Georgy Zhukov was the firm reference of the Soviet military movement for much of the 20th century. A complex personality, effective and dark at the same time, many of his actions reflected the ideal profile that Stalin demanded throughout his mandate. While he was one of the Supreme Leader's favorites, he was also the protagonist of many of his nightmares. Stalin feared that such a determined, respected, and ingenious commander could surpass him in the power game. Zhukov was not only the most decorated general in the history of Russia and the Soviet Union, but also one of the protagonists of several crucial moments during World War II. Join us to learn about the life of the man who is still a topic of conversation and reference and a source of proud memories for many Russians today. This is Reynaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia. On December 1st, 1896, in Strelkovka, Kaluga province, Russia, in a very humble peasant family, Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov was born. He was a child who grew up in extreme poverty, who from a very early age showed himself to be a very thoughtful young man, very thoughtful as well as outgoing, always focused on his obligations. In 1906, Georgy received a certificate with honors and graduated from the Belichkovo parish school, standing out for his good behavior. But at only 10 years old, he was forced to go to Moscow with his uncle to work in an industrial facility. It is known that part of his youth was dedicated to work days that exceeded 12 hours, often sleeping many of those nights on the factory floor. He also apprenticed to work as a furrier in Moscow, that is, as someone who works with animal skins, until in August 1915, at the age of 18, at the dawn of the Great War, he was drafted into the Russian Empire's army and called to serve in the Tsarist army's cavalry. After joining the Russian army at the start of World War I, he was called to the front line, where he showed merit for his actions such as the capture of a German officer. During the course of the war, he was promoted to the rank of non-commissioned officer for his great courage on the battlefield and received twice for his actions the highest military distinction of the Russian Empire, the Cross of St. George. By 1916, for his outstanding abilities, Georgy Zhukov received the privilege of attending the officer's course thanks to his tactical skills. While the ancient Russian Empire was waging a fierce war, along with the Allies against the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, various revolutions were exploding in the political and social bowels of Russia, cooked up from long ago. But in the uncertainty and the Russians' weariness of the war, the perfect opportunity presented itself for the anti-Tsarists to stage a coup that overthrew the monarchy, which became known as the February Revolution. Months later, the Bolsheviks and Lenin's supporters seized power by force in a second coup d'etat known as the October Revolution. Once the Soviet Republic of Russia was established in 1918, in a delegation led by the famous revolutionary nicknamed Leon Trotsky, the Russians signed peace with the Central Powers and withdrew from World War I. While all this was happening, the young Zhukov, along with thousands of soldiers from the Western Front, turned out to be a victim of typhus. While he was patiently recovering at home from the disease, a bloody civil war broke out in Russia. A so-called White Army was formed that grouped the pro-monarchist forces that rejected the new Soviet Republic, while the Bolsheviks in power strengthened the Red Army, also under the direction of Leon Trotsky. Georgy decides to join the Red Army and serve in what would be a long internal struggle between the years 1918 and 1921. During this civil war, Zhukov showed qualities of a brilliant tactician, earning the respect of his superiors as the course of the war progressed. In different battles, Georgy Zhukov was put to the test, achieving very good results and excellent performance on the battlefield and in the command of different companies. His skills were such that he received the privilege of leading several elite units, achieving a formidable performance. While serving in the Red Army in that confrontation, he received for the first time the Order of the Red Battle Flag for the brutal offensive he led against anti-communist peasant groups. His discipline, toughness, and rigor in battle consolidated him among one of the most experienced officers at the disposal of the Red Army, which was about to become part of the official Russian army. Amidst war in 1919, he joined the Communist Party. However, after this war ended with the victory of the Red Army, Zhukov remained in this army and was put in charge of a cavalry regiment, rising discreetly but steadily in the following years in the ranks of the Red Army. By 1930, Georgy Zhukov had been put in charge of the 2nd Cavalry Brigade and was part of large military exercises. From then on, he began to give lectures and write articles on how to wage war in the modern era. At 33 years of age, Georgi was already one of the most important and prominent men in the country in terms of the military environment. His learning set led him to study military sciences at the Frunze Military Academy in Moscow, where he graduated in 1931. However, his life was about to come to an end when, from 1936, when the leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, carried out the so-called Great Purge, a process of repression, imprisonment, and neutralization of tens of thousands of Russian dissidents. During this process, many division commanders of the Red Army and many high-ranking officers of the armed forces did not escape. Zhukov saw his superiors being eliminated one by one and ran the risk of sharing the same fate. The higher the rank, the greater the chances of being purged. However, circumstances saved him for the time being. Stalin decides to keep him among his ranks and in this way clears the path for Zhukov to continue rising in the military nomenclature. From there, the methods of Stalinism would continue to pursue Zhukov like a cloud over his head for many more years. By the end of the 30s, Stalin knew that a new great continental war was looming and was moving all the internal pieces with Germany. While this was happening, Georgy Zhukov was put in charge of the first group of Soviet armies from Mongolia, which expansion of his hegemonic influence and the war would be an opportunity for it. In 1938, Stalin was in the process of negotiating a non-aggression pact with Germany. While this was happening, Georgy Zhukov was put in charge of the first group of Soviet armies from Mongolia, which at that time was a formally separate province from China and supported by the Soviets. There, Zhukov played a role important after Japan and the Soviet Union entered into various hostile situations between May and September of 1939. These hostilities turned into the Battle of Khalkhin, where the armies of both countries fought near the border between Mongolia and Manchuria, which was the separatist province of China, but not supported by the Soviets, but by the Japanese Empire. The Battle of Khalkhin involved over 100,000 men. By August of 1939, Georgi launched an attack against Japan's military forces on Mongolian territory. After using his artillery and infantry to immobilize the Japanese, he sent his tanks to breach each of their fronts. His offensive surrounded the 6th Japanese Army after several maneuvers until it finally crushed it. In that confrontation, approximately 75% of the frontline Japanese troops died in combat. It was the first occasion that Zhukov extensively used tank units to surround and destroy the enemy. Subsequently, the fight ended on September 16th. For the pages of history, the Battle of Khalkhin was recorded as one of the largest tank confrontations that have been fought so far. For his success, Georgy Zhukov was declared a hero of the Soviet Union for the first time. By 1940, he was appointed chief of the General Staff of the Soviet Army and also took command of the Kiev military district. Zhukov had been developing certain closeness with Stalin and has a more personal approach with the Soviet leader in January 1941 after being part of a simulation exercise of war in which he won a simulated battle that, according to estimates, Zhukov was not supposed to win. His leadership skills and popularity that he was gaining among the Soviet troops unsettled Stalin's feelings towards him. However, Georgi maintained the rank of general after demonstrating his tactical abilities. Zhukov was a decisive strategist who took the necessary time to study each of the details of the battle. Moreover, he was a leader who demanded total, unquestioning loyalty from his soldiers. He was also popular for his relentless and totally cold attitude in making tough decisions. On one occasion, he did not hesitate to send battalions of prisoners to march through a minefield with the aim of clearing the ground of enemy mines. By the year 39, Germany and Russia had reached a non-aggression agreement, but after numerous tensions between both powers and pressures from Western Europe that had already entered World War II, the Soviet Empire and the German Empire went to war. Operation Barbarossa is unleashed, which opens up a whole new front of huge battle for the National Socialists to the east of their territory. It was an existential battle for Germany and for Russia. Initially, Zhukov is tasked with nothing less than the defense of Moscow against the fierce attack of the Germans. Between October of 1941 and January of 1942, hundreds of thousands of troops face off, and after a cunning defensive effort led by Zhukov, the Russians repel and thwart the German invasion. After leading units in this successful defense of the Russian capital, Zhukov proposes to Stalin to launch a counteroffensive, but Stalin rejects the suggestion, and meanwhile on other battlefronts, the Germans were successful in destroying a large number of Soviet troops. For this reason, in July of 1941, Zhukov was replaced by Marshal Shaposhnikov as Chief of Staff, after he proposed evacuating the region around Kiev to establish a more stable front. These were difficult times in Zhukov's military career, who hoped to see much more action in the conflict, but a fierce German offensive put everything into question. Despite this, Zhukov did not remain inactive for long, as he was tasked with advising the commanders who were part of the operations in the city of Smolensk and in the western region of Ukraine. In September of the same year, 1941, the famous siege of Leningrad began, in which the Germans intended to take the city, now called San. Petersburg, Zhukov was appointed commander of the Soviet forces around the city, which was in grave danger. Zhukov manages to stabilize the local situation, organizing a formidable defense of the city and a successful counter-offensive on the fronts that were possible. The foundations of this defense prevented the city from being taken by the Germans, who subjected Leningrad to a siege of more than 2 years with hundreds of thousands of deaths, but without managing to penetrate and take the city. This defense by Zhukov once again thwarted German operations in Russia. At the end of August 1942, Georgy Zhukov was entrusted with a new major task. The bloody battle for control of Stalingrad, now called Volgograd, had also begun. Zhukov was appointed as chief and sent to the southwest front to lead the defense of the city. In that mission, he and Alexander and Vasilevsky devised plans to completely destabilize the German Sixth Army. On November 19, 1942, the Red Army, led by Zhukov, launched Operation Uranus, the Soviet counter-offensive that changed the course of the battle at Stalingrad. In it, the German High Command underestimated the scale of the counterattack, so the Sixth Army was quickly overwhelmed by the Soviet troops. The Nazi general Friedrich Paulus received the order from the Führer to stay in place despite being completely surrounded by more than 200,000 soldiers of the Red Army. The intense fighting continued for another 2 months until in February of 1943, the German forces surrendered after running out of ammunition and food. However, at the same time that the counteroffensive was launched in Stalingrad, the Soviet army employed an attack known as Operation Mars, also directed by Georgy Zhukov, an operation against the German forces in Ref, near Moscow. It was a highly complicated operation for the Reds. Unlike their strategy in Stalingrad, Operation Mars ended in disaster after losing the battle with over 70,000 Soviet soldiers wiped out in massive frontal attacks against the German lines. But despite this setback, the accumulation of successes led General Georgi to be promoted in the midst of war to the rank of Marshal of the Soviet Union on January 18, 1943. In July of 1943, Zhukov again stands out in the Battle of Kursk in Russia as a representative of the Russian High Command. This was the last attempt by the Germans to lead a strategic offensive on the Eastern Front against the Russians. In a battle involving more than 3 million soldiers, Zhukov led the Russian operations and in less than 2 weeks manages to neutralize the Germans, the first time in the war that a German offensive was defeated before it broke through the enemy lines. This was a key battle, as from it the Red Army began to maintain the strategic initiative until the end of the war. As a final blow, Marshal Zhukov integrated a series of massive offensives that expelled the German troops from Belarus and most of Poland and Silesia. As a privilege, Stalin grants Zhukov the honor of entering history as the conqueror of Berlin. On May 8, 1945, it is Zhukov who sits down to accept the unconditional surrender of all German armed forces signed jointly by several German officials. Sagacity, cunning, and assertiveness turned Zhukov into a war hero for the Soviets during an existential war that marked the history of that country. Zhukov was in charge of being the inspector during the apocalyptic victory parade in Moscow's Red Square while riding a white stallion. It was the climax point of his record. He had earned the admiration and praise not only from the Soviet army, not only from his Russian people, but also from his enemies and adversaries. The American General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander in the West, was a great admirer of his maneuvers. In fact, it is said that both generals traveled together through the Soviet Union, almost immediately ratified the victory over Germany. But the supreme leader, Stalin, began to view with suspicion the popular love that the Russian marshal aroused. After the war, Georgy Zhukov was appointed Supreme Military Commander of the Soviet occupation zone in Germany. But he remained there for just under a year, as Stalin saw in the entrenched popularity of his general a serious threat to his power, as part of Stalin's post-war purges to consolidate his sole command. With the help of his police chief Lavrenti Beria, Zhukov was accused of exaggerating his own performance in the war and was soon assigned to the Odessa military district, a place of little strategic importance and few movements. It was a way to marginalize him from power without completely neutralizing him, as Stalin did with many other adversaries. The following years represented a deep debacle in his military career. In 1947, he was expelled from the Central Committee of the party, and later, by 1948, he was demoted to the command of the Sverdlovsk Ural military district. However, his chance for revenge would be near. In March of 1953, the supreme leader of world communism, Joseph Stalin, dies. This completely changes the political game in Moscow, and Zhukov is invited to return to the high Soviet military commands, taking the position of Deputy Minister of Defense of the Soviet Union. That same year, Zhukov is part of the tribunal that arrests and sentences to death Brenta Iberia, the same Iberia who a few years ago had directly pursued Zhukov and who at that time was vying to be Stalin's possible successor. By 1955, when Nikolai Bulganin becomes Prime Minister of Russia, Zhukov is appointed as the Minister of Defense. After obtaining the position, he was responsible for the invasion of Hungary following the October Revolution of 1956. This was a popular uprising that broke out against the Hungarian government and its Soviet directives. Georgi and most of the leaders were discussing ways to deal with this revolution without resorting to a massive military intervention. But when the new Prime Minister of Hungary, Imre Nagy, publicly proposed Hungary's withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact, that is, from the military coalition led by the Soviet Union, the Soviet leadership decided to use all military resources to defeat the revolutionaries in Hungary, and in this way they mobilized more than 30,000 soldiers to Budapest. More than 2,500 Hungarians and 700 Soviet soldiers died in the clashes. But his tenure as defense minister ended in 1957, and when he was dismissed and forced to retire from the Central Committee. After arguing with the then leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, about the army's policies at that time, Despite being very close to the General Secretary of the Communist Party, Leonid Brezhnev, and the Soviet leader, Alexei Kosygin, Georgy Zhukov was never again assigned another role of vital importance in the government. Perhaps it was in consensus of everyone, just like Stalin, that he was a threat to anyone in power. From there on, he remained in relative obscurity, where he devoted himself to writing about his memories, which he received permission to publish after Khrushchev was removed from power in October of 1964. During his last years of life, he continued to be a popular figure in the Soviet Union, admitting later that he was better at handling military affairs than political ones. Georgy Zhukov passed away at the age of 77 from a stroke in Moscow on June 18, 1974. And so the life of the four-time winner of the Hero of the Soviet Union distinction came to an end, demonstrating throughout his career to be a firm genius in the military field. Although without greater aptitudes for political life, his mere popularity and becoming an icon of Russian resistance caused suspicions and mistrust among his highest colleagues within the government on repeated occasions. Praised by leaders of all trends and feared by those who believed he would use the army to impose himself, a matter he never tried, his mere personality was enough to make Stalin himself tremble. This was the life of Georgy Zhukov. We hope you enjoyed this video. If so, please give it a like, turn on the bell notifications, leave your comments, and follow us on our Instagram account, also called The New Encyclopedia.